know that. And please do let me know if any issues around that following today's session, and we will manage that recording accordingly. So welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know Better Futures Australia, so I'm Lisa Cliff, the Director of Better Futures Australia at Climate Action Network Australia. So we are an alliance that's representing Australians across all corners of society and the economy so finance, business, agriculture, health, faith leaders, local state governments, First Nations, unions, and more to call for the ambitious national targets and policies that we need to get Australia on that 1.5 trajectory and a zero emissions, healthier, climate resilient, prosperous future for us all. So I'd like to start today's gathering by acknowledging we're all joining this call from First Nations land. For me, it's Yagara and Turrbal country here in Meanjin, Brisbane, that I now have the privilege to call my home. I wish to pay my deep respects to elders past and present, and am thankful for their wisdom in looking after country and leaving a legacy that all of us continue to enjoy today. And may we live up to the example that's been set in continuing to care for the beautiful land, water, and what we have to appreciate across Australia today. I invite you all on the call to acknowledge the countries you're calling in from in the chat and pay your respects. Just a note for latecomers, we are recording this session for those that cannot join us. And over the next hour, you'll hear from our 4 expert panelists who are working in the climate space to address the issues and deliver solutions in various approaches. Following a brief intro from each of our panelists on their responses to the IPCC report that was released on Monday night and the choices ahead for Australia, we'll have around 20 minutes for Q&A and finish the call on the hour. Also, my wonderful colleague Ajaya is in the chat to direct any questions to the panelists, so please do post questions as we go through. So also, just quickly, today's session is one of many sessions that Better Futures Australia is convening in the lead up to our Better Futures Forum set for the 15th and 16th of August this year. That forum intends to bring together stakeholders across Australia's economy and society to set a new climate agenda for Australia for the next 3 years. So we really hope that you can save the date and join us at that forum to really examine and unpack the opportunities ahead for decarbonising specific sectors and communities as we well and truly entering this critical decade. So I'd like to introduce you all to Professor Jacqueline Peel, the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures from the University of Melbourne. So Jackie is a leading internationally recognised expert in the field of environmental and climate change law, familiar to many of you on the call, I'm sure. Her scholarship on these topics encompasses international, transnational and national dimensions, as well as interdisciplinary aspects of the law-science relationship in the environmental field and risk regulation. And being here today, Jackie is the leading author of Chapter 4, International Cooperation, for the IPCC AR6 Working Group 3 report. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jackie.
Thanks, Lisa. I might just say that thank you for having me. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country today, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I should just say that I am a lead author on the IPCC Working Group 3 report. Frank Yotso on the call is also a lead author. There were 278 lead authors involved in this particular report, and I contributed to Chapter 14, which focuses on international cooperation. As far as I know, I'm the first Australian lawyer to be nominated by the Australian government to serve on the IPCC. I think having lawyers involved just reflects the fact that with climate change mitigation, we're now at the stage of the rubber hitting the road. It's less questions about why we're addressing climate change or what we should do, but the question of how is coming to the fore, and policy, institutions, community action are really important. I'm just going to give a few framing comments because we've got some really excellent people on the call today, and it'd be great to hear from everyone and also your questions. So just speaking about the report as a whole, it's important to appreciate that this is sort of one part of the overall IPCC cycle called the sixth assessment report cycle. We had Working Group 1 report last year, which focused on the physical basis of climate change. Then Working Group 2 very recently in February, looking at impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. This is part 3, which looks at mitigation and in particular a lot of the policy options that are available. The framing for the report is the Paris Agreement, which came into force from 2016 and sets those temperature goals that we're familiar with around trying to stay well below 2 degrees and aiming for pursuing 1.5 degrees maximum temperature rise above pre-industrial levels. Also, really importantly, this report is framed in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals and the broader UN Agenda for Sustainable Development. Even though Working Group 3 has a mitigation focus, there's been a real emphasis in this report on the connections between mitigation and adaptation, because we realise that we can't sort of do one without taking into account the other, and the broader implications for sustainable development and all of the goals that sit under the framework. Frank will say more about this, but the key message of this report is really the need for immediate action. So the finding of the IPCC is that in terms of 1.5 degrees, we're not on track. And that unless there are immediate and deep emissions reductions in the next decade, then we are aiming for temperature rises that well exceed 2 degrees of warming. At the same time, there are a lot of opportunities highlighted in the Working Group 3 report. It's almost a how-to guide, if you like, for the sorts of policy actions that could be taken. And that's a real change with this report. It's largely based on assessing real-world experience with policies that have been implemented, laws and institutions that are operating around the world to try and bring down emissions. So there's lots of good stuff in the report about options for taking things forward. In terms of Australia, I think the story is that we're missing a lot of those opportunities currently, particularly in terms of sectors like energy and transport, but many other areas as well, agriculture, industry, all of the different areas that are assessed in the report. I think for me, heading into the Australian election, some of the findings that are in the report around fossil fuels are well worth emphasising. We had COP26 in Glasgow at the end of last year, where it was applauded, the fact that we finally talked about the need for a coal phase down. It's almost like the Voldemort in the room was being named. This report really does call out the fact that fossil fuels have a limited lifespan, that coal assets in particular are going to be at risk of stranding before 2030, and that we're going to have, if we want to achieve those Paris goals, a low energy transition. That means that trade in fossil fuel will need to be a lot less. So for Australia, which is a very high emissions economy and a government that has pursued with strong vigour at the national level policies that promote increasing fossil fuel use and development, I think there's some really strong messages there. I hope that this report gets us talking more about climate change in the lead up to the federal election, but it does seem that it's off the agenda for a variety of different reasons. It is important that we keep talking about it, and this report perhaps provides a basis for highlighting the importance of the issue. Finally, just one thing that the report really does focus on is equity and justice issues. This is both in the chapters on policy and in the chapters on international cooperation and across the report generally. It highlights the inequities that exist at the global level, but also the importance of just transitions for delivering not only policy that will get community support, but also will be more effective in the long run. So I'm sure Amanda will have more to say on that question, but it's a report that's quite balanced in terms of saying it's super urgent, but it also needs to be done in a way, this transition, that doesn't leave large parts of our population behind. I'll stop there, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Jackie. And the first question off the ranks is one that we'll come back to you to address, I'm sure, where climate litigation is mentioned in the IPCC report. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Frank Yotso from the Australian National University's Crawford School of Public Policy. Frank is also Head of Energy at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. Professor Yotso's research spans economics and policy of climate change and energy, including decarbonisation, domestic policy choice, and international dimensions of climate policy. He is Joint Editor-in-Chief of the academic journal Climate Policy, has advised governments in Australia and international organisations, contributed to policy assessments in countries across Asia Pacific, and his roles with the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report are as lead author of the policy chapter and co-author of the summary for policymakers, and a member of the core writing team for the synthesis report. So the work is far from over for Frank. Thank you so much, Frank, for taking time out to join us and share your perspectives today.
I return thanks for the opportunity and to everyone for joining. So the report is really quite clear. It's not 5 to midnight for 1.5 degrees. It is midnight. The conditions are spelled out under which 1.5 degrees could still be achieved, and it's quite clear that these conditions will not occur in practice. However, the window for a 2-degree global outcome is really wide open. And in fact, the 2-degree outcome or below 2 degrees now appears more readily achievable than it did 8 years ago in the last IPCC assessment report. Okay, and that's despite the fact that global emissions have been increasing and we've been chewing away at that remaining carbon budget. And the key to that is the enormous improvements in technology costs, right? So the clean technologies that are needed have just fallen in their cost amazingly, right? So solar power, lithium-ion batteries, both have become cheaper, a factor of 6 over 9 years. Okay, and so that's really a game changer there, together with very positive experiences in policy implementation in very many jurisdictions, right? Policies have been implemented increasingly, and they are successful in constraining emissions and reducing emissions. Okay, now the report, in fact, the bulk of the report consists of a very detailed assessment of emission reduction options sector by sector, right? The barriers, the opportunities, the costs, the possible instruments. And from that is really where that positive picture emerges. The largest identified emissions reductions opportunities are in energy and in the land sector, okay? But really right across the economy. Industry, transport, buildings, demand-side options in terms of consumption choices, and so forth. All of these have tremendous potential identified at costs below $20 per ton. So that's really not expensive at all. 25% reduction in global emissions by 2030 identified at those low costs that could theoretically be implemented. And reductions amounting to a total of 50% reduction by 2030 identified at marginal costs below $100 US per ton. In Australia, $100 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent saved sounds like a very high number, but this is by and large the level of the EU emissions trading price right now and over the last year or so, right? So this is no longer kind of pie in the sky stuff. Australia has potential right across that identified portfolio of reduction options. The IPCC report does not provide country-specific assessments on mitigation. That would be impossible to get through the approval plenary, but we can draw our inferences from that. Much of the report, Jackie already mentioned it, is concerned about the broader barriers to implementation, firstly, and secondly, the relationship of climate policy with bigger objectives, such as sustainable development in the developing world, and such as just achieving other burning policy objectives everywhere in the world, right? Including equity distribution, not leaving low-income earners behind. Now, on policy, I've already noted it, greater prevalence of climate policies and climate laws, right? Especially in the G20 countries, but really across the board. Positive experiences throughout, policy instruments really very effective by and large in reducing emissions. We can, to an extent, even attribute it at this point. The signal is so strong, and the report really brings perhaps an obvious but an important conclusion, right? And that is that to be effective, policies need to come in packages, right, that address the entire scope of emissions reduction options and policy instruments that are complementary with each other. At the core of it is carbon pricing and economic instruments to really incentivize, in particular, lower cost options right across the economy. And that's then complemented by various regulations, by subsidy policies, by fossil fuel subsidy removal, by R&D support, by support also importantly for a just transition in communities that will inevitably to an extent suffer, in particular from the inevitable decline of fossil fuel production. Important point also made, once again, chapter 13, policy institutions, the need for really broad engagement across society in order for climate mitigation to be successful. And I think that's actually, for this community here in this room, really important message. And I think you can really take, I don't know what, heart and pride, in a sense, in a strong acknowledgement of that in this report, okay? So have a look at chapter 13, what it says about civil society. It's really some very strong words there about the need for comprehensive engagement, not just governments, right, not just business, but all of these organizations right across society. Very quickly, implications for Australia. Well, very obviously stronger ambition is needed. A coherent and comprehensive policy rather than this kind of patchwork and exclusion of particular policy instruments like carbon pricing and all of that, right? And of course, the report doesn't say, no, Australia bad, doesn't do this, like it doesn't for any country, right? But the inference that you can make from the general statements for any particular country's approach are very, very clear, in fact. For Australia, opportunities in zero carbon industries as well as in carbon dioxide removal, negative emissions, which newly is a relatively strong theme right through the assessment report. And of course, that theme of energy transition, the declines in coal, later gas, and the need to support communities in the transition also comes through very clearly. I'll just end on a couple of numbers. The report spells out that, the range of scenarios for decline in fossil fuel demand, okay, under a 2-degree scenario, it's not 1.5, this is 2, what is assessed as attainable is a decline in coal use globally by 65 to 95% by 2050, right? So that's the end, really the end, other than for perhaps a bit of met coal left for Australian coal production, right? Much more ambivalent numbers on gas, ranging from a 40% reduction to a 10% increase, reflecting, different assumptions about relative technology costs and opportunities, and also availability of CCS. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Frank. That was really insightful, and very much appreciate giving a shout out to civil society organisations, many on the call today, for continuing the great work that they're doing to drive policy advocacy towards better futures. Thank you. And next up, we have Laura Hillis, who is the Director of Corporate Engagement at the Investor Group on Climate Change, who leads the regional implementation of the Climate Action 100 Plus across Australia and New Zealand. She manages the corporate engagement program there at IPCC, with work on the thematic research on corporate climate change issues and relevancy to the investor community. She was a key contributor to the development of Climate Action 100 Plus, the net zero company benchmark in 2020, and led to the development of the initiative's 2019 and 2020 progress reports. And I also recently enjoyed reading the report on the corporate climate transition plans, a guide for investor expectations. Some really great work coming out of IGCC, and it's great to have you here to share the investor perspectives on this report. Laura, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Great to be here, and just want to acknowledge all of the hard work of my fellow panelists, Frank and Jackie. I can't imagine how tough it must be to be a co-author, and what an amazing privilege it must be as well. But it seems like it's a real multi-year slog, and it looks like you have to stay up a lot of nights and you don't get paid. So I just want to give you both a big acknowledgement from me that that's just a huge amount of work, and just delighted to be with you today. So to give a bit of context to my work, I work with mostly really large institutional investors. So a lot of the people on the call, I'm probably working with your superannuation fund, for example. Other than super funds, we also have a whole bunch of other investors in this ecosystem. So fund managers, and we're talking from the kind of managers that might be managing $1 billion in assets under management, which I recognize sounds like a lot. That's very small in our industry, up to many, many, many trillions in assets under management. And so why are we working with them on climate change? Well, climate change for an investor is a huge risk, and it's a huge responsibility. And there's also huge opportunities to be gained in the transition. And specifically, my work focuses on how do we get companies to de-risk what they're doing around climate change. My work, fortunately or unfortunately, focuses on some of the highest emitting companies in the world. So we picked out a list of 167 of the world's highest emitters. So we're thinking companies like Glencore, ExxonMobil, Unilever, BP, Shell, here in Australia, Woodside, Santos, BHP, big companies, big emitters, really challenging decarbonisation trajectories. And basically, when you look at a lot of the investors in the world, they tend to own big shares in these companies. So the opportunity there is they have a really big say and a really big amount of influence that they can use to apply to those companies, talk to their boards, talk to their teams, and say, look, what are you doing to manage climate risk? And I would say when we kicked off this journey 3 or 4 years ago with CA 100 Plus, we were very much focused on disclosure. We were focusing on who's managing climate in the business, how are you managing it? Whereas now we're having much tougher conversations. Conversations are very hard. I walk out of meetings some days and I feel very stressed and, almost sometimes a bit emotional about the conversations that we're having. We're talking about how do you wind down your assets? How do you close them? How do you do that in a responsible way that doesn't leave communities and workers behind? These are really tough conversations, and they're tough for companies and investors, because if investors are trying to convince companies to close assets, fundamentally that's going to have a financial impact, and they have very big decisions and trade-offs to make in doing that. And as we all know, the policy environment in Australia is really challenging. So that adds a whole additional level of complexity and obstacles to the conversations we're having, both on the company and investor side. So that's a bit of background as to what we're doing. In terms of the IPCC report, I felt that it had a couple of really key outcomes for us. I think the first one is it was pretty unambiguous in the need to decline fossil fuel production fairly dramatically. And as I said, most of the companies that I'm working with are fossil fuel producers or significant users. So it was a pretty unambiguous message there. We need to be having those really tough conversations about how do you close those assets. Another thing that I would say really came out in this report was there was a really clear message. A lot of the companies that we talk to are planning on using a lot of offsetting. They're planning on using things like carbon capture and storage. And there was a really clear message in this report that I think said pretty unambiguously that those sorts of negative emissions opportunities or solutions shouldn't be applied to justify new projects or expansionism of fossil fuels. And I think that's, again, going to be a tricky conversation to have, but a really, really important one. I think for investors, the takeout will be, as companies are still looking at expanding those fossil fuel assets and infrastructure, there's real worry that those assets could become stranded. That's a financial risk. That means essentially if there's no demand for those products in 10, 15 years, the assets become suddenly useless. But also there's a real legal risk, which Jackie will know much more about than I will, but that's a really significant issue. And then there's a social license to operate risk. The community are increasingly going to become fed up with these assets running when they are having to deal with the kinds of impacts from climate change that we're already seeing. The other thing, though, that I think was a really positive takeout is there's huge opportunities for investors and for companies in the transition, particularly in Australia. I think we forget about this sometimes because we focus so much on our thermal coal exports and we forget about the fact that we're also a huge exporter of things like iron ore, which will eventually hopefully be able to be turned into green steel once that production is up and running. There's huge renewable energy opportunities, which we know. There's green hydrogen. There's other critical minerals. There's actually a huge amount of opportunity for Australia in this, and also an opportunity to diversify our economy, which will not only be good for the community, for investors in Australia, but it'll also attract global capital to Australia, which is really important too. I'd probably just leave it there, but I would say if anyone's interested in just getting into a little bit more detail on, the kinds of things that I think it's useful if you're talking to your superannuation fund about these topics, if anyone wants a bit of a rundown of kind of the things that I think you should be asking for, then I'm very happy to provide a bit more detail on that as well.
Thank you so much, Laura. Some really insightful pieces there that I was just scrambling to note down, and a great invitation for anyone on the call to reach out to delve into more detail and get some collaborations going to piece together climate resilient futures in Australia. Thank you. And next up, we have the excellent Amanda Kale. Dr. Amanda Kale is the CEO of The Next Economy, and the focus of her work at The Next Economy is to support regional communities across Australia to manage changes in the energy sector in ways that stimulate local economic development. Amanda has worked successfully to support all levels of government, industry, workers, and community groups to understand and manage different aspects of the energy transition, particularly in Queensland, the Hunter Valley, Latrobe, and Amanda has a PhD in human geography from the Australian National University and adjunct positions at the University of Queensland and University of Sydney. And it's great seeing the work of The Next Economy just recently, with great efforts out there to engage members of those frontline communities to do the important work of reducing the anxiety around what those zero emissions futures hold, and including working with unions and other important voices across Australia. Thanks, Amanda, for joining us.
Thanks, Lisa. And also doing some work with the University of Melbourne through Melbourne Climate Futures with Jackie as well, which has been great to build that relationship. Laura beat me to it. I was also really wanting to acknowledge the work of Jackie and Frank and all of the authors. Like, there is so much work that goes into these reports. It's just astounding. And I just want to acknowledge your resilience in hanging in there, and all the climate scientists out there as well, and to keep at it. And also the really great work that IPCC is doing. That work with industry is really starting to come through. And we're finding in the work we're doing with communities, it's actually industry being the loudest voices now advocating for national policy certainty and regulation. Who'd have thunk it? So as Lisa was saying, the work we're doing is directly with regional communities. Often it's a mix of local government, state government, and industry players, and then unions, environment groups, and other community groups, trying to find ways to bring them together to get past sort of debating whether or not this needs to happen or what climate change is, to the practical tasks of how do we manage change because it's here. And we've really seen a shift in the discussion just over the particularly last 12 months, from people sort of saying we want to have this conversation, but we don't think we can have it because it's too politically sensitive, to now being inundated with requests from some of the most diehard coal mining communities in Australia saying, we know this is changing now and we need to get our heads around and develop a plan as to how we move forward into the future. What does our economy look like beyond fossil fuels? Also areas where there's electricity plants as well. And we're seeing increasing early closure notices that are starting to come out. So people are moving beyond that kind of division that we saw in the last federal election to now a lot of anger actually at government that not more has been done to actually have their back moving forward. So what is that? What does that work look like? And I guess the big thing that's shifted the conversation has been not just the talk about the risks that we see in the IPCC reports, but a real focus on what the opportunities are moving forward across all sectors of the economy. We've kind of been stuck on this energy question, and there's been a lot of debates around coal versus renewable jobs, for example, but it's getting much more nuanced now around how do we take climate action in a way that builds new economic opportunities, attracts new investment and jobs and industries across regional areas in energy. So whether that's renewable energy or renewable energy manufacturing of parts, batteries, green hydrogen, green steel, looking at diversifying mining, land use, which was a big focus of this report, and how that can be used to draw down emissions. But there's the big pieces of work we need to do around looking at transport long-term, but also waste in other areas and buildings and energy efficiency. Also the focus on adaptation, which is interesting in the report. We actually didn't need to do a lot more on that, but we need to be looking at it as an economic opportunity as well, because there's a lot of work that we need to be doing across particularly regional Queensland at the moment and looking at that. The risks, if we don't get it right, and these are touched on the report, but what's really interesting is how much they're coming through at a community level is failing to transition, like more community members talking about not meeting 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, but also increasing pushback against renewable energy projects because we have an engaged community. So we're seeing a lot of opposition against wind farms, for example, that is going to increase if we don't engage people better. Concerns about booms, like having a silver bullet kind of approach this and just large industry instead of diversifying sectors and not sharing those benefits and actually having not just the social impacts, but also where can we actually look to improve conditions for people. So these are things that are being talked about a lot more. But the key thing that we need to look at in terms of moving forward is, and this is what's coming from communities, is that policy piece, which Frank talked about, and actually having an integrated industry saying we need a plan, we need clear targets, and we need a lot more investment. But we also need bodies that are actually going to be responsible to that. So there's a lot of interest in Transition Authority, and the electrical trade unions have just released a report on the importance of that. And to actually take the lead then on looking at workers' issues, infrastructure planning, how we ensure we protect the environment moving forward, and we don't just solve the climate crisis, but create other environmental issues and make sure those benefits are shared, including financial benefits across communities. So if you want more detail on that, we're actually releasing a report called What Regions Need on the Path to Net Zero on the 27th of April. So you can sign up to our website and you'll get notification of that. But I'm happy to go into both opportunities and risks in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And just some really important points raised there around, providing that certainty and the national policy settings and a framework that we can all work within on a level playing field. So excellent insights shared by all our panelists, and we've had numerous questions come in. So I'm going to attempt to, I'll quickly note Mike's question. There's a bit of a technical question that I'm hoping maybe Jackie and Frank can respond to in the chat. Just noticing a footnote on many of the pages of the report that says do not cite, quote, or distribute. Why is that? So maybe I'll leave you both to, if you know the answer, to address that for Mike in the chat. But really a question for all of you to start. So as Amanda just noted too, there's been a lot of scrutiny from the UN Secretary General and others recently on Australia's contributions to the global carbon budget and the global climate negotiations, that we're not doing our fair share and we're being a laggard in terms of global progress on climate. So there's a couple of questions, one from James and another from Anonymous. But Daisy's question as well is kind of linked to this, so I'll combine a few here. So do you have thoughts on what we should be calling on the Australian government and world leaders to commit to come COP27 in Egypt this November. And if you had maybe one step or one policy recommendation that could be adopted this year from the IPCC report, what would you like to see happen ahead of COP27 from the Australian government, whoever that happens to be come June this year? Who would like to start us off?
I'm happy to start, Lisa, and then
Thanks,
I'm sure
Jackie.
Frank and the others can add in. Look, one of the things that comes through very clearly in the IPCC report is that current government pledges in terms of our nationally determined contributions do not add up to what we need to be on track for 1.5 or even to achieve 2 degrees of warming. So clearly there needs to be increasing ambition with respect to those pledges, and there is a lot of commentary in the report about the extent to which the sort of wealthiest nations and the wealthiest individuals have the most capacity really to contribute to emissions reductions. So I think that as Frank says, there's no assessment scorecard in the report of different countries' activities, but you can draw some pretty straight line conclusions from some of the messages about not being on track, about inadequate nationally determined contributions and targets back to the Australian context. So at the very least, strengthening our 2030 target and having a credible plan for getting there would be key things. I'd also say on the sort of policy and legislation front, Frank's emphasised the importance of these integrated policy packages, which is one of the clear messages from the report. But there's also quite good experience that's covered in the report about countries that have framework climate legislation, which has been missing in action in Australia at the national level, obviously. So there's quite good evidence that these laws work, and in particular to provide accountability for governments around how they set targets over time, because one of the key problems that we have with climate in Australia is the mismatch between the longer term nature of the problem and indeed the transition that needs to occur and our short electoral cycles. So legislation that kind of locks in a process can be really helpful in navigating a way around that. And I think some of the other things that are coming forward, Amanda mentioned sort of interest in transition commissions, point to the fact that if you can have more lasting legislative and institutional structures that are a little bit apart from the day-to-day politics, that this is really important for a well-managed transition.
Thanks, Jackie. Maybe we can throw to Frank if you're ready, but more to James's question on the specific policies and actions recommended in the report, maybe for specific sector decarbonisation plans, what could be adopted by the next Australian government. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, thanks. And can I just briefly come to the previous question of what might Australia take to COP27, right? So very obviously a stronger 2030 target, right? I mean, head and shoulders above everything else. It's just this is totally and utterly inadequate, what we currently have, 26 to 28 with a view to 35. And may I say the target that the Labour Party is putting forward in the lead up to the election is not equally, but also inadequate, right? And so that needs to change. Let's just do a quick maths here, right? So if the world needs to be 25% below current level emissions, right? And if every country in the world did 25% below current, right? Now we're something like 20% below 2005 now, right? So we're talking more than 45% below at 2030 for Australia, if every country did the same, right? And this is just impossible to ask on developing countries to do the same as rich countries like Australia, right? And out of that, do these kind of computations yourselves, right? But anything that's less than 50% reduction for Australia is totally incompatible with an IPCC-based assessment of what 2 degree means, right? So that's it. Secondly, a proper national long-term low emissions or net zero emission strategy, right? So document was provided by government late last year, totally misses the mark, right? Had a specific purpose, probably sort of, government internal purpose. We need an actual strategy, right? And so we've been advocating for this a little over the last year or so. You can identify best practice on this, and best practice is an open, inclusive process to create a strategy that's not just sort of techo in terms of, where the reduction opportunities, but that tries to understand what this means for the country, right? Where are the economic opportunities, where are the social flashpoints, how are we going to get this done, and how are we going to get this done together, right? And so, I've called for that quite openly. There needs to be an inclusive process, a kind of a roundtable process, right? Where civil society has an important role to play in actually feeding into this process. Climate Change Authority, in my view, would be well placed to lead such a process. But if it is prevented from doing so or not tasked to do so, then someone else will need to take the reins on this and just run with it, right? And so, if it's a Labour government, then this should be something that really should be taken to a Labour government to do properly. If it's a coalition government, then I don't know, maybe they'll change their view on these things, at least gradually. And if not, then someone else will just need to take the running of this, for the country. Like if government can't lead, then, someone else will need to. On the policy patchwork, well, the answer is obvious, right? And, if we were to do this properly, then we'd just have a complete policy reset on climate policy and start with something comprehensive that's fresh and that's clean and that's effective. Politically, I see no feasible pathway to that federally at this point in time, right? So the pathway is a gradual one. And thereby probably a long road, right? Now, if it's a minority government, whoever's actually in power, I think the prerequisites are better for making progress on this. But it will be gradual, and it means that this entire community will need to keep pushing for, just call it sensible policy, right? Okay, enough.
Thanks so much, Frank. And yeah, definitely, we all on this call, I'm sure, are empathizing with everything you just said there, and that it is, at the position where a lot of the private sector and subnational governments are making it the rational and reasonable case for the feds to step up and follow their lead. So that's a positive, and hopefully a segue to some questions that Amanda and Laura, I'm hoping you can come in and address these. So we've got one from John. Report mentions methane emissions. How important is Australia's signing of the global methane pledge for 30% emission reduction on the 2030-2020 levels? And is the reduction achievable with action in reducing fugitive emissions across the fossil fuel sector? And agriculture. So Amanda, hoping you might have some insights from your work in regional New South Wales, Queensland, in the fossil fuel communities there. And then also, Laura, there's a question there on the 2 degree and 1.5 pathways, in particular, the view around overshoots, and also there was a question there around the management of risk and de-risking the investments of institutional investors, and how you ensure they're not just offloading risky fossil fuel assets to others that will continue to emit. So those two questions. So starting with you, Amanda, thank you.
That last question's a good one, because I'm seeing that happening already. When you see the big miners getting out of coal, they're selling to the next tier companies. And if you look at what happened in the US and Appalachia, you end up with small companies that just leave the town and don't do any rehab, etc. But I'll leave that to Laura. In terms of the methane side of things, there's a lot of talk in the Meat and Livestock Association of the 2030 target. I'm not sure how they're going on that, but the big question we're not dealing with in Australia is gas, and the huge expansion and planned expansion of gas projects across Australia, and the meat and the fugitive emissions that come with that. There's a lot of talk about, gas is 50% better than coal, but if you look at work that I think ANU did late last year, once you factor in both fugitive emissions plus also the transportation and pipeline developments and things like that, then it's way worse. It's actually worse than coal and keeping that going. So I think we need a lot more discussion and focus on gas, not just coal, moving forward. But also it's really astounding, I think, in these groups, we kind of have a sense of some of the more nature-based solutions to reduce emissions and the opportunities in the land sector. People don't know about it yet. It's kind of talked about in this circle. We need a lot more engagement with farmers and to bring together very different streams that have been talking about this differently. You've kind of got conservation kind of focus, and you've got the Indigenous land management over here. Then you've got, beef cattle over there, and, meat substitutes over here. And forestry is a whole other different sector. We actually need some really clear and easy resourcing around supporting land managers of all types to actually be really boosting that, because there's trillions of dollars, international dollars, that could be landing to support us on that. So it's an area for more work.
And I'm happy to jump in here. I might actually leave the 1.52 overshoot question to Frank, potentially, if you don't mind taking that one, Frank, because I think you'll add more value than I will. But I will cover off methane gas and then talk about the issue of selling assets. So methane, that was probably one of my picks for what I'd really like to see at COP27, a commitment from the Australian government, but it would also need to have a really significant amount of work on actual regulation, because at the moment, the gas industry emits we basically know what they tell us. So they tell us that there's very limited amount of methane flaring going on, but when it's been measured, and it's never properly been independently measured in Australia, or it has been once, but it was a very limited study. But when it's been measured in other markets, it tends to be overestimated by a magnitude of many times over. So we suspect there's a lot more flaring going on from oil and gas companies, and there is no legislation, there's no regulation that prevents it. They're getting a completely free kick, and investor view is flaring should be illegal. It should just not be allowed to happen. Companies should be paying huge fines every time they do it. So there needs to be real regulation put around that. And it's definitely something that we're going to be focusing on, both in the lead up to COP on the policy side, but then also looking at it from talking to industry associations and government. And the companies to get them to better disclose as well. On gas, I could not agree with you more, Amanda. It's a huge issue. It's one of our biggest focus areas in corporate engagement at IPCC. We have a dedicated gas working group. We're working through a whole range of issues. Probably the biggest issue that investors are focused on at the moment is that sort of argument that's being made that gas is better than coal and it helps displace coal in Asia. So if Australia sends LNG to Asia, that has a net benefit for climate. The gas industry is very strongly arguing that position, but there's very limited evidence for it. And investors are getting very concerned that what is actually going to happen in Asia is coal will be displaced by renewables, particularly given the economic case for renewables over time and the increasing changes in things like carbon pricing and regulation. And when that happens, we're going to have a whole bunch of Australian gas projects that will be completely stranded, and the companies will basically run out of money. That is a real significant risk in Australia at the moment. So it's something we're really heavily focused on. We're actually releasing a report on the topic next Wednesday. If anyone is interested, we worked with an energy modelling organisation to look at new Australian gas projects and look at what happens to them under 1.5 to 2050. It's a really interesting piece of work, so I would encourage everyone to look at that. And then lastly, the big topic, which is selling of assets. So my take is investor views on this have changed, and I think it's changed as the sophistication in the investor community on climate has increased. I think back in, say, 2017, 2018, 2019, there was a very large Australian mining company that sold off all of its coal assets and no longer owns coal assets. And at the time, I think that was received pretty well, because if you're an investor, you're looking at your own portfolio, what do I own? And you're going, how do I reduce the risk here, in this specific portfolio? But I think what's changed since then is there's been a real shift in investor views, because they've suddenly realized, well, actually, if I own a slice of the whole economy, and big investors always do, they own something, their portfolio is typically representative of everything in the economy. They recognize that every single investment they have, no matter what it is going to be affected by climate change. It might be more or less affected by the transition, but everything's going to be affected by the physical impacts of climate change. So climate change is a multi-stakeholder systemic risk. It crosses everything. And so if your company does want to sell off whatever asset that is, it's still in the system. It's still going to impact the rest of your portfolio. It's still going to impact your beneficiaries. So I wouldn't say we've actually gotten to a really clear set of guidelines on exactly what we want companies to do on this topic just yet, but the messages are changing to, if you're a big company and you have a really strong balance sheet, you should hang on to the asset and wind it down responsibly. There's still a big gap though in terms of what does that look like? What does it look like if you only produce that one thing? Do you wind down your entire company? Open question. And then the other question is, if you're a big company and you do a whole bunch of different things, what does winding down that one asset look like? What does it mean for the community? What does it mean for workers? What does it mean for investors? So we're actually planning to do a piece of work on this later in the year to really get a really clear set of expectations from investors on what do we want companies to do who have these assets, who own these assets and are going to need to transition them out. But I would say it's still a really challenging space at the moment. So definitely something we're keen to work more on.
Thanks so much, Laura. And before jumping to Frank to expand on the methane question there, also, yeah, the great suggestion that Frank has a crack at the 2 and 1.5 pathways question from Monica there. And we've got an addition, Frank, that before you, I know you have to jump off for another call at 1. So from Tamara, what is a good target on gas phase out that Australia could include in their next enhanced 2030 NDC, given the annual increase expected now? Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, good discussion. I'm following the chat as well. So 1.5, firstly, right? So the report is really quite clear about that. It would require immediate, deep, absolutely comprehensive action. And yeah, it's just not on the cards. And so, 2030 reductions relative to 2019, 40 to 50% for 1.5, not going to happen. 1/4 for 2 degrees, right? I don't know, we can make up our own minds whether that is going to happen. Current pledges and policies are more on a 3-degree trajectory, but it could happen, right? It'd be feasible, including economically, right? And then there's, of course, a huge space between 1.5 and 2 degrees, right? And 1.8 is better than 2, and 1.7 is better than 1.8, and all of that, right? Now, the question of overshoot, most 2-degree scenarios can also be 1.5 degree overshoot scenarios. Namely, you shoot over all the way to 2 degrees, and then you're gradually coming back down to 1.5, right? And this is then mainly a game for post 2050, about which it's really hard to make sort of sensible judgments. All of these kind of integrated assessment modeling exercises represented in a report go to 2100, but something that's 50 years in the future is really like, we're guessing about, the urgency of the problem, how it will be seen then, the economic opportunities, the technology. I mean, who knows, right? So this is much more about the near term and sticking as close as possible to 2 degrees as we can. Methane, so global methane pledge, 30% reduction by 2030. Super hard to do in Australia, actually, right? Because it's just not going to happen. No part of this is going to happen all by itself, right? It's very different from the coal to renewables transition, which has a momentum all by itself. Different from the transport electrification story, which will gather momentum by itself. And sort of needs policy facilitation, investment facilitation. All this methane stuff is basically a question of some technology improvement, which could be forced through regulation, right? In particular, in the gas industry, with tighter standards to minimize leakage in gas pipelines and gas processing, this kind of thing. And we just have no effective regulation, and that's worth advocating for. But that's not going to get us 30%. What would get us 30% and below is a shift in product mix, right? So less gas production, less gas processing for export. Well, good luck, right? That's a really hard one. And the other one is beef and sheep, right? And so, there's kind of a contradiction. NFF, right? Meat and livestock Australia have net zero targets. But I'm not sure whether they have an idea as to how they would achieve them, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done there. If the idea how to achieve things is to somehow buy cheap offset credits from someone, right? Then that's, people need to begin to understand that that's not realistic. What was the final one? A gas target. For Australia. So so not, you know, emissions from fugitive gas and this kind of thing, but gas use. What would be realistic? It's realistic to expect that gas use in Australia will decline, and will decline a lot, right? Because contrary to many assertions, it is likely to play an increasingly marginal role in electricity generation, right? So we're hearing a lot from a lot of players, including government, of course, that gas has an important role to play in the renewables transition, right? That is true, but it is not true in a quantitative sense, right? So a lot of gas use in electricity right now is gas use that we wouldn't need gas. We can fulfill that through renewables plus storage very easily and quite cost effectively, right? What we'll need gas for in the electricity sector is mainly as a backup fuel for periods of extremely high demand, or extremely low solar plus wind supplies, right? So the windless nights kind of scenarios, right? When storage is also depleted. And the overall share of gas in electricity generation, just look at the AEMO scenarios in the integrated system planning, right? Gas really just tails off, right? And then gas use in manufacturing will increasingly be displaced by electricity use. And in specific growth like fertilizer production, you know, there's increasing opportunity to just replace it with hydrogen, which you can again make from wind and solar. And so the picture there is a really optimistic one. It's hard to put numbers to it, right? But domestic gas use could fall like a lot, right? Over a decade for sure. Okay, I'm talking too much, and thank you very much for listening. It's really great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Frank. And if you do need to jump off before the hour, please feel free. We won't judge you, and we will just greatly appreciate you for the time we had you. And thank you for all the great work you're doing. Just to jump to Jackie and Amanda and Laura quickly to give your last thoughts in response to, there's a question there around the role of litigation for you, Jackie, and also a question on the investment community's appetite for an industry transition fund. So I feel like there's some links there to the question around whether Australia has potential to get on track for a, I still want to say 1.5 or 2 degree trajectory without a legislated carbon price or similar. And then maybe, Amanda, there's a question in there for you for the receptiveness of fossil fuel workers and the transition communities. So Jackie, would you like to kick us off with those? Thank you.
Yeah, look, there's lots of great questions there, so I can't cover all of those different aspects, but I'm sure Laura and Amanda can chip in as well. On the litigation front, just to highlight that the IPCC report does talk about climate litigation. Frank, I think this is the first time that the report's covered climate litigation, and it covers it both in the chapter that Frank was working on, which is about policy, and also in the international cooperation chapter. It's looking at climate litigation in a global sense and noting that there's been growth in climate litigation, particularly since the Paris Agreement. Really, if you look at the figures, it's sort of gone from bubbling along at sort of small levels in a few countries to suddenly taking off in a big way and across many more countries, and in particular starting to extend to many countries in the global south. The jury's still out really on whether it has the kind of impacts that we might hope to see from climate litigation. There are an increasing number of cases that are taking on governments, particularly around their emissions reduction targets. We haven't been able to mount a case of that kind in Australia just yet. There's lots of ideas around it, but the legal frameworks are quite difficult. But where we have seen those cases overseas, they do seem to be producing results in terms of governments changing course. So there's a bit of a flow-on effect for climate governance. And just picking up on something Laura was saying before about legal risk for investors and for companies, there's an increasing level of climate litigation that's focusing on private sector actors. And in this regard, we often see a kind of bigger ripple effect from one case than you might expect. So companies and investors have a low appetite for legal risk, I think. And so even though often it's a small number of cases that are targeting big companies, and very often David and Goliath style battles between civil society and big companies, where we do get wins like the Shell case, they do seem to have ripple effects. And here in Australia, we've seen some innovative litigation that was brought against the Rest Super Fund, for example, that was settled. So you'd kind of think, well, why would investors pay much attention to that? But it does seem that a lot of investors took notice of that, and there's been quite a strong reaction from the superannuation industry to at least begin to be more transparent about how they're managing climate risk. I might stop there, Lisa, but happy to come in on other questions because you fired a bunch off before.
Thanks, Jackie. And yeah, we'll be wrapping now with the final comments. So also, yeah, going to Amanda and Laura for those questions around litigation and appetite in communities for a transition fund. So Amanda, and then
I'm
Laura.
happy to jump in. Both at a community level and an industry level, there is a huge appetite to be having this conversation. Something has shifted. It's not like whether this is going to happen now. It's people know it's happening, and they're really worried about it not being managed well, particularly in resource communities, because they're used to the boom and bust cycle. They know what happens when people leave town very quickly. So it's actually fossil fuel workers now and the community saying, where's the plan? Why isn't government doing more? Who's going to fund the next industry? These big green hydrogen developments, are we going to end up with worse impacts we haven't even thought of yet? So those questions. But interestingly, industry are the ones in the room saying, legal risk is being talked about. I'm getting requests from boards to address them around what their opportunities are in managing this stuff, how they talk to their workers and their communities, but also the finance. Money is moving. Like one coal community came to me and said, after Glasgow, we're taking this seriously now because we've got 5 new coal mines that have been approved for the last 5 years, and the money, they're just not getting the finance. So what are we going to do? Because we've got 3 others that are closing and nothing to replace them. And also the insurance risk. There's a lot of insurance pressure on companies as well. So it's happening, but we need all of the framework, the institutional framework and the policies to enable the money to flow and to actually protect people as things change.
I'll try and be super quick. If it's okay, Lisa, I might just focus on the superannuation, what you can tell your fund bit, because it looks like there was a bit of excitement in the chat. But Monica, if you're still on the line, send me an email about the energy transition fund thing. I think it's a cool idea. Super funds. So chances are, whatever your super fund is, it's invested in some kind of carbon intensive assets. It might not be fossil fuels, but it probably is. Frankly, most of them are. You might think, let's tell them to sell it. And we could be here all day. I don't want to do that to Lisa. If we had the argument about whether it's better to sell it or hang on to it, but let's assume they're going to hang on to it. What do you want them to do? I personally don't think that boards are going to really comprehensively change their strategies and make these tough decisions about winding down assets until their investors start to vote against the re-election of directors. Once they're looking at losing their jobs, they will do something about this. So my message to you is write to your super fund, ask if they own any carbon intensive assets. Do they own a coal-fired power station, a gas pipeline? Do they own AGL? Do they own Woodside? What do they own? And tell them you expect them to vote against the re-election of directors where there is not a 1.5 aligned climate plan. That is the best thing you can do. Get all of your friends to do it and just ask them, tell them that that's what you want to see them do as a beneficiary of their fund. And I think we'll start to see companies change if that starts to happen in a big way.
Thanks so much, Laura. That's a great way to wrap up, giving everybody an individual action they can take, and then a reminder that the bigger action is talking to your candidates for the upcoming election and making it clear that credible climate policy is something we all expect from our national government that puts us on that 1.5 trajectory. Frank can tell me I'm insane for keeping that number in mind, but I just am going to keep saying that. And I just wanted to, again, so Frank has had to jump off, so I'll send him a very heartfelt email, because there was a comment in the chat. I noticed that we could all sit here listening to these excellent panelists for hours or days, I'm sure, to pick their brains on all the things. Such a pleasure listening in and seeing glimpses offered by you all to different possible better futures. So thank you all for the work you're doing. You've each highlighted that as a country, Australia, we have the choices and mitigation options ahead that can put us on that lower emissions pathway and build those climate resilient, healthier, prosperous and happier futures for us all. So to all of those of you on the call that joined us, thank you for listening in and for all you're doing. And if you're not yet connected into Better Futures Australia, please do reach out. The links have been shared in the chat, and we look forward to working together across all corners of society and the economy to work with government to put Australia on track for doing our fair share under the Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Frank. You're champions. Keep doing what you're doing. We love you. And yeah, all the best for the rest of your busy days, I'm sure.
Thanks Lisa. We love you too.
Thanks, Lisa. and don't stop saying 1.5.
Yes.
As Frank said, you know, the difference between 1.5 with an overshoot and 2 is minimal in these assessments. So keep
totally
on
every little bit.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks all. Apologies for going over time.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.